recording on this computer.
All right.
Everybody do the mouth warm-ups.
I'm going to put a new ticker in the chat there. You're listening to Coding Blocks Community Talks. Be sure to like and subscribe and find more developer conversations at codingblocks.net.
Yeah, and this time we're trying something a little new, heavily inspired by Jay Miller's Productivity and Tech Roundtables. We thought those were really cool and wanted to try something kind of like that. And I think Andrew and Sean had a really cool idea about talking about OverArchitecture. So we're going to give it a whirl.
Yep. So we'll start by having each of our panel tell us a little bit about yourself. We'll start with you, Alan.
Hey, so I'm Alan Underwood. I am a co-host of the codingblocks.net podcast. By title, software architect, manager, and developer. And, just always trying to make things a little bit better than what I found them in the first place. So, and constant learner.
All right. I'm Andrew Diamond from the Cleveland area. By title, software consultant. Kind of just a guy who plays with code. Nothing else to it.
I'm Dave Follett. I'm from the Metro Detroit area. But my title, I think, is Senior Research Engineer, but doesn't really mean much. Do a bunch of different things. I've played around with just about every language over the years. I guess that's just about it. I like to learn too, and I'm really happy to be a part of this.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I'm the odd one out here. I'm in the UK. I'm James Studdart. I'm a .NET development consultant and also the host of the weekly tech podcast, Cynical Developer.
All right, I'm Joe Zack. I'm also a host of Coding Blocks, and I like static languages, dynamic libraries, and long refactoring sessions.
Okay.
And I'm Michael Outlaw. I'm the last third of Coding Blocks. I can be found at I am Walto on Twitter, software developer. And that's what I don't know what else to say other than that.
I'm Sean Martz. I'm also a software consultant in the Cleveland area, and I will be your moderator today. So with that, let's just jump in. We're going to be talking about OverArchitecture, and let's just start with what is OverArchitecture?
Who wants to take that one?
I have a simple answer to this question.
I like simple answers.
Okay. OverArchitecture would just simply be code that solves problems you don't have.
So the YAGNI principle, right? You ain't going to need it.
Interesting.
Is it really a solve if it's not a problem?
Well, I think it's kind of like what we've joked about on the show before, right? Where our canonical reference here would be Alan, where you got to scale out this application that you're working on, to a billion users before you even realize that you need to scale it out to a billion users.
So the question though is this, right? I think we should pose to the guys is if that's what OverArchitecture is, what does that mean? Are we talking about too much software, too much hardware, too much, what are we saying here?
There's no such thing as too much hardware.
Yes. Thank you.
I don't know. I might have a little bit of a different idea about what is OverArchitecture. I think overarchitecting is when the code gets too clever to reasonably follow.
Yeah, when it's broken down into those compositing bits and they're so disparate that you can't read through it. No matter what you do, you get so far and then you get lost because something magically disappears and you've got to go and pick it up somewhere else through another application. And maybe those endpoints don't even marry up properly. So you might be coming out with one name and it's calling the next endpoint as something else. And that endpoint is actually now changed and it's called something different. Getting lost in code, I think, is the biggest thing that smells to me and says this is over-architected.
Lost in Code is the new series on Netflix. I don't know if you've watched it.
It's just all of us swearing at our computer for 8 hours.
Danger, Michael.
Compile.
So is there a difference between over-engineering and over-architecting? Is there one or the other that we're talking about today particularly? Is there a difference?
I feel like they're the same. I feel like at the core, they're the same. When you're architecting a system, you're essentially just engineering it. So,
yeah, it's funny going back to our architecture series that we did the I don't know 20,000 episodes on recently. That was the thing, is people use architecture in terms of, typically they're talking about the stack that they're designing, when that's not really what architecture is. So I agree. I think that over engineering and over architecting, they're probably interchangeable in terms of what people actually mean when they're talking about it.
Do you think that over architecture could be more about like your system design, and then the engineering part more like the lower level class pieces? I mean, if you wanted to try, I mean, I agree they're pretty interchangeable, but you could make that distinction.
I think when you're starting out with a project, the first thing you do is that it's architected, is when you're putting those initial building blocks in, and then you carry on architecting as you're working on it. But I guess that was more the engineering part, for me anyway.
Well, I mean, if we were to follow along with Uncle Bob's clean architecture, that goes through even at the code level. So it's not just about like connecting hardware and different pieces of software together, in regards to architecture. So I think they're very interchangeable. Okay.
So I'm going to jump us ahead here. Who's ever worked in an over-architected code base? I know Andrew and I have. We tried to basically we worked in a system that had one controller for every endpoint, and it managed to serialize the classes and all that stuff. And it was a pain to try and debug or make any modifications to or anything like that.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's not so much that there was like a ton of code as it was like a really clever solution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, like overly clever, like super smart. Yeah.
Sure. And then you had to have a documentation about how the code works. And so you're trying to debug something and you're like, what is going on?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And I've worked with code that's like that, and it can be demoralizing, I think, at times as well, having to work with the system like that, because you look at a change from a customer or a bug and you think, oh, it's a 5-minute change. And then you spent 3 days banging your head against it, because what should be really simple, you chased your tail for 5 or 6 hours, and you get to a point and you go, oh, let me just go back and check that. And then you come to, I better check that because I've forgotten. And it's that trying to be too clever, I think, at times.
Yeah, it's funny. So I feel like some of this over architecture almost bleeds into under architecture. I mean, Joe and I have talked about it before. Like there was an application that we worked on to where, I don't know if they didn't like source control or I don't know what happened, but they'd literally have like V9 calling V8, calling V7, calling V6. And
to be clear, those are specifically in the class names.
In the class names, like you'd actually have files that were, order processor V9, order processor V8, order processor V7. And the thing is when you arrive there, when you're the person that picks up that code at the end, it looks way over architected, when in reality it was poor planning that created that, right? And so like the whole chasing your tail type thing, it was incredibly complex, but it really shouldn't have been, right? And so it's almost the inverse. But I've also worked in code where people did try to plan for a babillion concurrent users, or just tried to go way over the top, right? When really all they needed was a simple like a CRUD application, right? Just read right to a database, nothing special, but they had to have the latest frameworks and they had to have the latest everything installed to do this. So you got 20 tiers, and it was just incredibly difficult to reason about.
CV-driven development, or resume-driven development.
Resume-driven development. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. Good.
I was going to say it's also tough too, though, because there's times where, like, especially as the developer, you might be given a task and you're like, well, what you're asking me to do and the way you're asking me to do it would totally be over architecture for what actually needs to be done. But in the grand scheme of things, there may be like a bigger ask, like a company-wide policy at like a corporate level that, that's much higher level than the, smaller organization that you're working at, that is dictating some policy or that you have to implement. And so you're trying, unbeknownst to you, the company is trying to adhere to that policy.
One thing I wanted to mention is that I think that kind of as software engineering industry has matured, it's gotten a little bit easier to not do this. Like when I was programming like 10 years ago, and we would work on a project, we'd say, okay, we've got system 2 coming out. Let's plan our hardware. And so we'd start speccing things out. We'd buy 3 web servers, 2 database servers, a caching server, and we'd get all this stuff planned out. And then, version number 2 of that software then roll out for another 9 months, 11 months, 12 months. And then that server just wasn't as good as it used to be. And so I think that now that we've got things like cloud and kind of CI and Agile is really prominent, I think that has kind of helped, but I still think that it's very possible to overdo something. Well,
I'm curious, those guys that were saying that they've worked at them. Dave, you've been quiet down there, but I'm curious what you guys, you said that when you had those things, they were a little bit harder to debug. Like, ultimately, what were some of the other side effects? Did it take longer to update these things? Like, if somebody asked for a change, was it painful to do that? Was maintaining it a challenge? Like, what were the fallouts of this type of thing?
Yeah, so for me, when I've experienced this, is you'd be looking to add a new feature, change a current feature, but you couldn't really tell exactly what it was that you wanted to do where in the system. So that was always very, very hard. And then because the system was so hard to work with, you ended up with domain specialists on the application. So I couldn't just pick it up and know everything about the system. I'd have to go and speak to, say, a tech lead. That tech lead will go, well, I didn't actually do anything with that. You need to go and speak to XYZ. So you go and speak to them and go, well, I only did this bit of it. The bit that you're looking at is this bit, and you need to go and speak to somebody else. And then you'd spend half a day just even bouncing between people. And then you get it and you go, right, now I know where I need to work. What was it I needed to do again? And you, like I said before, you get stuck in that sort of same loop with the knowledge base, as well as trying to find out in the code side of it. But if the system's also not documented, it's very hard to dive into. But I think once you get to that certain point, I think even documenting a system like that is going to be nigh on impossible.
So in our specific case, it was very easy to add a field. So if you just want an additional field or something, I mean, that saved us the whole 30 seconds that it would have been adding it in a couple places. But anytime we had to do anything custom with that field, or that field triggered, some validation, or when this field is this, something else needs to happen, that's when it just became a mess. And it became spaghetti code very quickly.
Yeah, it almost felt like it was over-optimizing for the simplest case, and then anything beyond that, anything beyond the case that it thought through, the developers of that framework thought through, was just incredibly complicated.
Was that because it was too specific for a certain problem?
Yeah.
I know the situation I'm talking about, I think the system was the opposite end of that stick, and it was too generalized. So it had no exact purpose, so everything was written in a sort of fuzzy way.
That's what I see a lot too, is we're trying to make things too common. Like everything has to be super common. With build 12 variants of
super
very
dry
similar things, and it adds a lot of complexity. But the flip side is putting them all in silos, and then you get no reuse between them. So it's hard to get in that balance.
I mean, that's a common theme here, right? And I think that's why this conversation is useful, is there is no perfect path, right? Like, there's never going to be a perfect path in software development. Like, you can't just say, hey, if we go down this way, we're never going to run into a problem, right? But is the over-architecturing of that more problematic than the under-architecting, right? Like, if somebody just goes and does something willy-nilly and doesn't adhere to anything, does that create a problem, right?
Yeah, what's worse?
I gotta say, okay, let's go back to the original definition that we gave, right? That over-architecting was solving problems that you don't have. So then under-architecting would have to be not solving the problems you do have. And I gotta feel like that is way worse of a problem. You know that there's a problem there, and for whatever reason, you're just like, no.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that definition specifically. I think under-architecting is not solving the problems that you have in the most efficient way possible, right? So you have to do a couple maybe extraneous steps to solve that problem, but the problem's still solved, I would say.
Yeah,
like dropping out certain things like IOC and stuff like that, and splitting everything down properly. Is that what you're talking about with under architecting it? Just doing it the way that you see example code online. You have a Windows app and it's just that program CS file, and that's it. And it's thousands and thousands of lines in there, but it does the job. It meets the business problem, but it's just not maintainable.
That's kind of where I was going with that, and that's why I think it's an interesting question, right? Because when you under architect, if you always have to have the problem in mind, right? Like they're solving the problem. I think a lot of times over architecting this is where things get crazy, right? Over architecting can be way more expensive at the beginning when you're doing that, right? Because everybody has to get on board with understanding the frameworks and the patterns and everything that was done. Under architecting may be a lot cheaper up front, but in the long run, it also might start becoming way more expensive as people have to add to and maintain that stuff over time. And again, I think there's a fine balance, right? Like there is the how much is enough design up front to get you into a good spot and not leave you hanging so that you're writing a bunch of garbage code.
I don't even think that long run could even be that long of a run. Within a couple of weeks, you could start seeing, just depending on how complicated the application is going to be, within a couple of weeks, you could start seeing return on that investment of like writing the code properly. Versus if you just started writing your program.cs file and kept going and going and going, you're going to very quickly hit a lot of pain. Just a lot of it.
Yeah. And sort of taking what Andrew was saying there, I was working on a project showing a team on how you build an application properly. So good practice. I don't like to say best practice. And this project had sort of 15 projects within a single solution within Visual Studio. And people were looking at it going, why? This is so overly complicated. But then the requirements changed before we even got anywhere with it. And it's a case of, right, if this had been done the old way, we'd have to scrap this and start again. All we do is we write new implementations of those interfaces, drop those in, job done. And I think that sort of stuff's really good. And not doing that is under architecting and leaving yourself open for massive problems. And we talked about cost. You got a whole rewrite there, whereas we've lost maybe a couple of hours on a couple of implementations rather than the last 6 weeks or month or however long it's been that you've just been spent writing that code.
Sure, you want to make your code flexible enough that it can handle a couple unforeseens, but when you start making it too flexible, then it's like, okay, we're not even solving a business problem anymore. This is just we're making a framework again, guys.
Yeah.
You want to over-architect a little bit then, essentially. Just keep a little buffer.
Well, what I was kind of thinking is Steve Smith, at our Dallas, he talks a lot about pain-driven development. And since we all know, we're very rarely writing perfect software, right? We're always out of balance. Then it's kind of a matter of recognizing which side you're on at any given time. Like if we're under-architected, then I'm doing a lot of copy pasting or I'm doing a lot of if statement type stuff. But if I'm over-architected, then I'm really tempted to work around my architecture in order to do just some little simple thing. So I think as long as we can kind of recognize what's going on there and kind of adapt to that situation, I think that's that's the true goal.
Is there any sort of pattern that you could see that sort of starts flashing alarm bells with that? Because you say, oh, we're going down this route. But for me, it's always once I've got to the end of that road and gone, oh, damn, I've done this wrong.
So
static now.
To look back.
So
yeah,
Dave,
absolutely.
what'd you say?
Oh, it's always easier to look back. Like I can never tell that I'm over or under or doing something right or wrong until it's like it's all done and it's like, oh shoot. I mean,
I'm not putting this on my GitHub profile.
So I was going to ask though, and this goes back to the original question: how can you tell if you're over architecting? When Sean asked that, right? So, and I think this is a good takeaway. What James just said a minute ago was, he had these projects that had interfaces that you could then create implementations of, right? Is that over architecting, or is that good design up front? Versus what is the heart of when you look at something and you go, oh man, they made this way too complex?
I think when it's uncomfortable to develop in, like, you know, when you go into a new code base and it's just, when you're not comfortable and your understanding of the application, it just becomes, when that's kind of when it starts becoming painful. And that kind of is the flag of, hey, this is probably either over or under architected. It could be either. I think it takes a skilled developer to be able to tell the difference.
That's what I was going to say. That whole comfort thing comes at different levels of expertise, right? Because as a junior dev, you're not going to know anything about, IOC containers or anything like that. So you're going to look at that and go, what in the world's going on? So there's definitely a line, and it sounds like we're talking about the line from somebody who is familiar enough with good patterns and practices to be able to get in there and go, this really shouldn't be this hard.
Yeah, so for me particularly, it's when I start running into these voodoo debugging situations, right? Like, hey, why didn't this work? Oh, because this was named plurally instead of singularly. And like there's no documentation on that. You just talk to the guy and he's like, oh yeah, you just got to make sure everything's named singularly instead of plurally. And you're just like, why is our code dependent upon that?
Yeah.
So when you start getting into these weird voodoo debugging situations where you're just like, I have no clue what's going on and I can't even begin to track down this problem, that's when I think you start getting into that over-architecting, or you're into that over-architecting.
Magic code.
Yeah.
Magic.
Yeah, like, oh, you didn't start with the underscore, then my code didn't pick it up. One idea I wanted to throw out there that maybe is totally crazy, but maybe it's not, is static analysis. Like tools like NPen or SonarQube will give you some metrics around like how abstract your code is and how concrete, and it's got the whole zone of uselessness, whatever, and it'll kind of graph it for you. Maybe that's like an objective way of taking a look at your code and like saying like, hey, I'm pretty far to the left or to the right here. Maybe I need to bring it back towards the middle.
I've never used one of those tools.
Oh, they're good.
Yeah. Are they? They are pretty good.
Some of the problems that we're describing, though, sound more like just bad code, bad architecture, not necessarily where there's over or under, right? Because when I think about over or under architecture, it's more about like, okay, the clean architecture book from Uncle Bob, right? He kept talking about like deferring decisions. Defer a decision for as long as possible, and then when you absolutely make the decision, then when you absolutely need to make the decision, at that point, then you have all of the information. You have more information to be able to make a more intelligent decision than if you had made it like a year ago, right? So when I think about over-architecting, though, that's when you're like making those decisions up front that you don't even know if you're going to need.
Right.
And similarly with under-architecting is like, you can see that this thing is a pain, right? You can see that whatever your current data retrieval and storage solution is not scaling, but yet you, for whatever reason, decide you're resistant to changing that. That, to me, is an under-architecting decision. But does that make sense? Like, it's not necessarily in the code itself about like, your plural versus singular example, but I mean, not that couldn't be, but do you see where I'm going with that distinction?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think kind of to that point, I think that a lot of times what we're saying is that over-architecture is just kind of the wrong architecture because we tried to plan up front. And so like that example you guys talked about earlier where we've got like one controller that's kind of owning everything, that might be a great solution for somewhere that we're spinning up dynamic web services, right? And so we need like one sort of, entry point because we don't know what's going to exist at compile time. It's just that, we solved that problem, but that wasn't the problem that we had.
Mm-hmm.
I think what Sean said is actually really interesting. When it feels like somebody is creating a framework or you're almost tailoring towards a framework, that could almost be the smell of over-architecture up front, right? Like when the cleverness and the patterns take over the business use case for the software that's being created.
That's an excellent definition. I definitely kind of follow that when it starts to feel like a framework, and maybe it's just because I consider myself a remarkably stupid developer, so I try and keep things very simple so that the next guy is like, oh, I know what's happening here. But when we start to get into the framework, I'm like, listen, somebody smarter than me has written something better than this, so there's no point in me reinventing the wheel.
I think we need a T-shirt that says I'm a remarkably stupid developer.
I can't even tell you how many times I started to create a game and ended up starting to work on an engine, even though I have never even made a game. Like somehow I'm supposed to know how to make a game engine.
So I think we covered that. What, how can you tell if you're over architecting? And I've never done this personally, but I know that some of you guys have probably written over architected code bases, right? So how do you deal with somebody on your team or something that they are over architecting? Like, how do you politely tell them, like, hey, this is overkill. We don't need this. Let's stick to the business use case.
Oh, this is why I work with computers. I don't know.
People skills? What?
Who wants to take this one?
I think for me, doing this, it's approaching the person in a peer review, maybe even not on a peer review, and get them to explain why they've done something a certain way. Because it might not be that it's over-architected. It is when you're looking at it, because you're looking at just the pure problem. Maybe they've looked around it, they found some edge cases that this needed to deal with, and you're not aware of it. So by having it out with them and sort of saying, well, what's your case for doing it? Okay, right, you've done this. You've done it this way. How easy is that to test? Show me the tests that you've written, and then looking for code smells in the test. If they're not testing the single code units, then there's red flags there. And I think it's being able to objectively pull those out, or leading them enough so they pull them out themselves.
I think that's a great way of addressing it, both like the person-wise, like asking the questions. It's not so combative as saying like, hey, you're doing something stupid. And also, I think by kind of doing that, like either you're going to find out why they did it that way and feel good about it, or they're going to end up kind of coming to that conclusion themselves as they say, well, the reason you have to do all this weird stuff is because it's, the pattern I set up isn't really congruent with what you want to do. Maybe I should change that, or maybe we should kind of peel some of the stuff back.
Yeah, because you never want to go into that situation being the almighty arrogant developer going, I know everything. This is the best way to do it. Do it my way. One thing I always tell people that I work with is I have strong beliefs that are weakly held. So I will tell you things are supposed to be done a certain way, but you tell me how they should be done. And if you can convince me, then great. I'll learn something from it. And I don't know everything and never will know everything. So it's going in it with an open mind and none of that arrogance. Being a little bit cynical about myself.
Andrew, you look like you had something to say when this all kicked off.
I was gonna make a comment about how I don't know if you should address it until it becomes an apparent problem, but I think the problems could be subtle. You wouldn't realize them. You might not realize that it's taking an extra minute and a half, 5 minutes to set something up. So my point was kind of self-defeated. But to learn off of that, I mean, the problems you'll see are going to be hidden. So you do need to address them. You do need to, identify when something is over-architected and communicate that, immediately as soon as you see it. You can't just ignore it going because, the senior dev says this is exciting and new and we're going to try it, so we're going to do it. Because it could be wrong. I mean, regardless of your experience, everybody's written pretty terrible code, whether you have 25 years of experience or not. You're going to write bad code and you're going to over-architect, so you need to be open to accepting this criticism as well.
So along that peer review thing, like I'll give this advice, and this is something you'll even get in interviews going forward in your career, is sometimes you'll be asked, hey, there's somebody that's hard to work with on a team, right? And this is almost the same thing with somebody's doing an over-architecture type thing, right? How do you deal with this person? And my recommendation has always been, don't do a one-on-one. Get other people involved that are going to be working on that code base or that have to work with that person. And then that way it's not a he said, she said, and it's not a personal, attack or any kind of combat between people. It's literally, hey, let's talk about the problem, get multiple people involved. And so then it's not just my feelings or my experience versus your feelings and your experience. You get the people involved that are going to be working on that business problem. And then at that point you say, hey, what is the key issue that we need to talk about here? And then let everybody get out their thoughts on it. And then that way a group can come to a conclusion and it's not a mine versus yours type thing, right? And so a lot of times I feel like that's probably a decent good way. Now there's going to be situations, and I've seen it happen. I mean, several of us have seen it happen to where you've seen something that's being over-architected and you go talk to the person, either by yourself or in a group, and they're still going to say, this is how it's going to be done. And then you have to suck it up and move on. So there's not always an answer to it, but I think it is smart to at least get it out there on the table.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go down or across at your level. So if you were speaking to another dev who's the same position as you, easy enough to do. Speaking to somebody lower than you, easier to do. Going and speaking to somebody above you, that can always be intimidating because of their knowledge and their experience, and in some of my experiences, their attitude as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a question though. Like with some of the answers that I'm hearing, it sounds like, for the most part, the panel agrees that bad code equals, over or under architecting depending on the situation, right? Is that what you guys think, or you guys agree with that? That
No,
bad code?
No. I think that you can have incredibly good code that is way overkill for a situation, right? Like I think that you could have some of the cleanest patterns, you could have some of the most incredibly thought out things, and you just don't need it. Like I said, in the situation of a CRUD application, right? Like let's take the simplest application in the world. You have a survey that people fill out, and then you basically just want to spit out the results of the survey afterwards. If you've got 20 frameworks and 50 layers just to literally take in that input and then spit out a report off of it, like you've probably over architected it, even if it's the most elegant code on the planet, at least in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
One example I was just thinking of is like you were tasked with building a service for monitoring another service. So you go in, you really tackle the problem, you think about it really hard, and you build a website that monitors, and it also gives all sorts of stats about the apps, and you can click little buttons to run certain kind of like cleanup actions on that app, and everything's great. And they're like, okay, it's more than what we wanted, fine, but can you roll it out to these 5 services too, these other ones? You're like, oh well, this is kind of finely tuned to this one specific case. And now I can't really easily add these 5 other things. And so while technically I solved the first problem, I didn't do it in such a way that it's easy to solve the bigger problem.
So getting too specific instead of too general
Right.
can be an issue as well.
Yeah, ahead of time.
Okay. So this one, I'm going to defer to the guys with more experience than me. Is over-architecting more common with certain languages or environments?
Hey, Dave, you haven't said anything in a while.
Yeah, Dave.
Gonna put me on the spot.
Yeah,
That's right.
Well, if we call an environment like a business environment, I definitely think that there can be pressures, extra pressures to overdoing it. Where I work, we work to contract, so we have to bid things all up front. So we do a lot of requirements and designs, and we have to do all of it up front because we have to come in with the cost. And if that cost is off by 10%, and we win that contract, we could go out of business being off by that much. So sometimes that can lead to it because that you're trying to solve all this stuff and trying to make sure you got everything covered, but maybe you overdo it just to be sure. So I think there's definitely some business environments that can lead to that.
I mean, just to expand on that kind of answer, it's kind of like that old adage, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail, right? And so you think back to like some environments, right, where some business environments where, take IBM, for example, there was definitely a period of time where it's like, oh, hey, you need, what is your problem that you need to solve? Well, surely you must need WebSphere for it. And it didn't matter what you were trying to solve. Maybe, I'm not trying to dog on WebSphere. Maybe it was what you needed, but it was like, that was definitely going to have a place in the overall solution, no matter what.
I did want to mention Java, but now after Dave's answer, I really think a lot of it has to do with just kind of the business you're in. Like, also if you're like a Google scale or something, then obviously like if you need to think about those kind of scalability issues, then upfront planning is probably a bigger deal. And if you're in the business of like kind of coming up with requirements and bidding and fixed bid contracts, then it's really important. And then in that case, you kind of can't be too specific on what you're promising and what you're building, right?
I mean, it's interesting. Go ahead.
The other part about the bid too is when the contract ends, sometimes you will get follow-on work, sometimes we don't. But it's also we don't necessarily get that time to iterate on our solutions or design. So it's like, well, I better put some extra stuff here and I put some extra stuff here because I'm not going to get this time to iterate on it afterwards, and so you kind of just get that pressure to put some extra in there.
That's interesting. I mean, it speaks to the environment part of this question, which I'm glad it was put in there because I didn't even think about this. But the environment can have a lot to do with it. So you're talking about you have contract work that you guys have to hammer out for people within a certain percentage of getting it done, right? Like that's a way different pressure than if you're building something for a customer service team inside your own organization, or if you're building something for external people to use, right? Like it all drives it differently. And even within the business, like if you work for a company that owns their own cloud, you're probably going to be heavily driven towards using their own cloud services, right? Whether or not they're the right answer for the entire solution, you're going to be using what they've already built, the tooling that they have, and the patterns that they've already followed. So, yeah, I mean, and the certain languages, I was also going to say Java, and this is not me picking on Java, but I feel like one of the reasons why I always had frustrations with Java was there's so many different ways to do something. And I feel like that has just made frameworks spring up.
Yeah. Freudian slip.
Left and right. Like literally, it's, I mean, if you go .NET, C#, whatever, there's pretty well prescribed patterns and libraries and things that are almost common to everybody use, right? Like if you're looking at an ORM, Entity Framework, sort of the de facto. There are other ones, but you go over to the Java world and guess what? You're going to find like flame wars online about which ones to pick. And so, yeah, I feel like Java is one of those that has a tendency to have a ton of that over architecture.
All right. So is there a correlation between over-architecting and over-generalization of a system? I think we kind of nailed this one. You can go either way with this, right? It can be either too specific or too general, too abstract or too concrete. So we can probably skip that one.
Yeah.
So is there a happy medium? Where is it? Can you apply yank and need it without breaking solid?
Like, can you get to solid in the first place?
that's
I'm still working on that.
Yeah, that's a myth.
Well, you ain't going to need it all solid.
Probably both, really.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just a matter of like readjusting constantly.
Yeah, I think that happy medium was really just a buffer between you're not doing enough and you're doing too much. I feel like the true good portion doesn't actually exist. You're always going to be either too little or too much. But as long as you're within a certain range, then it's conducive to your environment. You're conducive to your development, and it's good. It's a good thing.
It's probably integrated with the fact that there is no one right way to do anything. There's a lot of right ways, but there's definitely wrong ways to do stuff as well. So we could say what is bad, what you shouldn't do, but what should you actually do? Well, it depends on your preference.
Yeah, that's a great point that you brought up there. I've always had that issue, especially when I was a junior developer coming up. There's all these examples of don't do this, don't do that. I'm like, okay, well, how do I do it then? You've just shown me 3 ways to do it and then said all 3 ways are wrong, and you haven't shown me a good way to do it. So do I just choose which one I like out of the wrong ones, even though I know it's wrong?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, it says, we said we're kind of always out of balance. We're always struggling. We're always trying to get to that perfect platform. And it makes me wonder if it's like, how do you know if you've over-architected something? It's the answer is if you feel good about it.
If you ever feel like you're clever, you're proud of something, you probably did it wrong.
Yeah, you did it wrong. So yeah, you're only doing it right when you feel like you're doing it wrong.
Hey, so tell me this: what if we went round here, and each person said the one thing that they think should be included? So what you just said, Sean, is somebody will tell you that there's 3, 4, 5 different ways to do something, and then it's like, well, which one of these is right? What do you guys think is core to at least have in place so that you could say that you've got a good framework to build on, a good sturdy base, but you're not going too far in? Like, I mean, let's just put each other on the spot here. Like, what do you think is a core thing that should be included
I'll start because this kind of goes along lines of what I was going to say to this answer to the YAGNI versus solid, was that the biggest takeaway that I had from that clean architecture book was deferring your decision. Like, don't make a decision until you absolutely must make the decision. And that's when you're going to need it. But until then, you ain't going to need it.
So you're talking about like infrastructure decisions, like which type of database you're going to run or what
It
type.
doesn't have to be infrastructure. It doesn't
Okay.
have to be, but just deferring the decision until you need it. That would be my takeaway to your answer,
Okay.
your question.
Who wants to go
So-
next?
I'll go next. So one of the things that I actually just recently dealt with was not having an actual code entity or code path for a specific thing. So going back to this generic controller, right? We didn't have to have this code path for the code to enter, right? This entity to enter the code. It could just magically happen in the generic. So I think there should always be some type of very clear code path that an entity will follow. It shouldn't just be this magic, nebulous, ethereal thing that's like, oh yeah, the framework just handled it. Don't have to worry about it. It just happened. So you should
Screaming
have
architecture.
What's that?
Sorry, I'm terrible about it. Screaming architecture, just the idea that like you should be able
Yes.
to look at something and like have it be very obvious like what the point and how it's working.
Yep. That's actually, screaming your architecture.
Okay. Joe, you spoke next. What you got?
Yeah, I'm a jerk. Sorry. I was just thinking if we're talking about starting out, then like if you don't start with tests, you're probably never going to get there. So that's my answer, even though, tests kind of stink.
That's a cop out.
Okay, fine. Then logging. Don't neglect logging.
No, you can't do that when somebody else can have it.
Oh, yeah, it's free.
All right, Andrew, you're next up on the tile board here. What you got?
Logging. No.
Logging.
No, I'll have to agree with Michael. I mean, I think deferring your decisions is the most important aspect you can really do. Like, to think back to many applications I've worked in, if we've just pushed the decisions back farther, I really feel like better decisions would have been made, better code would have been written, and it would have just been better overall. And so deferring your decisions is the most important aspect that I've learned from development, I think.
Okay. What about you, Dave? What you got?
I'm going to say stick to directly working on solving the problem. And if your problem's too vague, stop and, break the problem down and define it. I think that's another way that I fall into this trap, is if the problem or the requirement that I have is it's just too broad, and you try to solve it in a broad way. And so just stick directly to the problem.
Cool. James, you?
Yeah, I think for me, it is when you're developing something to keep in mind that you're developing it for Sean or somebody like Sean, being the poor developer that he said he was. So keep it
Remarkably
simple.
stupid, not poor, just remarkably stupid.
Sorry, remarkably stupid.
The wealthy, remarkably stupid.
So keep it simple, stupid. I want to be able to look at something and know exactly what it does straight away. Keeping it simple is paramount, I think.
Okay. For me, I honestly, now this will go with statically typed languages. I think for me, it's having the right number of abstractions and not going too crazy. So what James said earlier about, there were 17 projects within his solution, but many of those were just the interfaces so that the implementations could happen. As time's gone on, I used to be a guy that was like, why am I going to write an interface for this thing, right? Like, this doesn't make any sense. But as time goes on and you see the need to test and you see the need to swap things out, I find that having those abstractions, those interfaces in place really help ease some pains moving forward. So for me, I think it's having good abstractions in place so that you can swap out or make changes to code without breaking everything downstream.
So I'm going to piggyback off you there. How do you learn that? How do you find that balance?
You know what?
Experience?
You know what? I honestly, this is the part that drove it home for me was test-driven stuff, or making sure you have unit tests in place, because it forces you to think about the problem differently. When you have something like we've all talked about it, a lot of us, I don't know what type of software you guys all develop, but for a vast majority of probably mine, Outlaw's, and Joe's career, it's you got a database, you got a UI, and you got to get things back and forth to the database, right? And so your thinking was always the data is the core of my application, not the business logic. The business logic was almost always tertiary, right? But it was really, how do you get this stuff in storage? And so when you think that way, a lot of times you literally just have your classes talking directly to the database. Even if it's through a layer of a DAL or something, it's still talking directly to the database. And then if you ever needed to test that thing, it was nearly impossible because you'd have to create integration tests. And now you have data that's changing all the time, so you can't really run those tests and get the same results out every time. And so if you start thinking in a test-driven mode, or in a way to where you can unit test your code, you have to have those abstractions. Otherwise, you've got to leverage the existing architecture in place. And so just taking that one step towards testing will make you think about, okay, well, what do I have to do so that I can test this code, right? Like, do I have to have an in-memory data store that can be tested? And if so, then I need to be able to swap that thing in for the real database connections whenever things are happening.
All right, so testing and streamer architecture, defer your decisions. Those are the three main takeaways. Yep, I think we covered everything on our list here. Someone let me know if I'm missing anything.
No, I think that's it. So that will conclude our conversation on OverArchitecture. We hope you've enjoyed it. One last time, let's have everyone on the panel here tell us how you can be reached. Start with you, Alan.
All right. So again, I'm Alan Underwood. You can find me on Twitter at @theAlanU, or go to codingblocks.net and reach out to me up there. And also, importantly, Slack. Come over to our Slack channel at codingblocks.slack.com, and everybody here is on it, so you can reach me and everybody else there. And if you @ me, I'm more likely to find the response, because there are a lot of messages flying around.
Or if you say headphones 3 times.
Headphones 3 times, yeah, that's like Beetlejuice.
Andrew Diamond. You can reach me on Twitter at Andy.Diamond, or like you said, the Coding Block Slack at Andrew.Diamond.
Yep, I'm Dave Follett, and the best place probably on the Coding Block Slack, or I'm Super Good Dave.
All right, and Zack can be found wherever Coding Blocks is found, and my name is constantly changing on Slack, so good luck.
I'm Michael Outlaw. I can be found on Twitter at IamWalto, which is Outlaw spelled backwards for those curious like what that is. And you can also find me as well at www.codingblocks.net, or on the Coding Blocks Slack as at Michael.
Yeah, James Studdart, because we skipped me. Jumped the gun there.
Oh, man.
I'm such a jerk.
Yeah, twice.
But we're not keeping count.
Right.
No. I don't hold a grudge or anything.
Right, yeah,
it's okay. He's totally over it. He got over it twice now. How over it he is.
Yeah, so you can find me in the Slack channel. You can find me on Twitter at Cynical Devs, or through cynicaldeveloper.com, and on Facebook as well. So, just give me a shout on there.
I'm Sean Martz. You can find me on Twitter at a terrible handle that I now regret. It's the @ symbol and then @ Sean's handle. So
you're like
double adding this. Actually, just go to the Coding Block Slack. That's going to be the best place to find me. I'm pretty much always out there.
Oh, that's amazing. All right. So I'm going to hit stop.